In Renaissance Italy, where holiness and sin danced a macabre waltz, a little girl's purity was sacrificed on the altar of papal ambition. 500 years later, the name Lucrezia Borgia still sends shivers down the spine. She was born into a world where her own father would wear the triple crown of St. Peter while planning her fall from grace. What happens when the guy who was supposed to be Christ's envoy on earth turns his own daughter into a porn star in the most sinful of games? The answer is one of the darkest stories in history about power, perversion, and the loss of innocence. In Renaissance Rome, 1480 was not only the year of another birth, but also the start of a tragedy that would last for hundreds of years. Lucrezia joined a world where the Catholic Church was so corrupt that even people who lived at the time were horrified. Rodrigo Bouillet, her father, would later become Pope Alexander VI, who is widely considered to be the most debauched pope in history. The papal throne. Rodrigo had already started to manipulate his illegitimate children with Lucrezia at the center of it all, even before he became pope. The Renaissance is known for its artistic and intellectual growth, but it also had a dark side where morality was up for debate and power was the only thing that mattered. In the papal kingdoms, there was no longer a clear divide between holy and unholy. Cardinals openly maintained mistresses and sold church jobs to the highest bidder, and planned killings with the same zeal that they planned masses. The Borgia family didn't just take part in this malfeasance. They made it flawless, turning vice into statecraft. Lucrezia was born out of wedlock to Rodrigo Borgia and his mistress Vanza de Catana. Because of this, she should have been forgotten. Instead, it was the first link in a chain that would tie her to her father's sick goals. Other illegitimate children of the time were either hidden away or disregarded, while Lucrezia was raised from birth to be for a certain reason. To be a living treaty, a breathing partnership, and a gorgeous bargaining chip in the Borgia family's never-ending quest for total dominance. Lucrezia grew up in Rome, a city where poison was as common as prayer. Assassins hid in every shadow, and even the holiest places of worship were not safe from political machinations. The Vatican itself had turned into a place of sin, where orgies took place in papal chambers and the buying and selling of cardinal ships was as open as any other business. Market transactions and murder were only another way to get what you wanted. Lucrezia was thrown into this moral wasteland before she even knew what kind of game was being played with her life. Modern records show that the papal court was so bad that it would have made Sodom and Gomorrah look good. The German scholar Johann Burchard, who was the papal master of ceremonies, wrote down unbelievable scenes of debauchery like the legendary chestnut meal when 50 courtesans crawled around. Naked on the floor of the papal residence picking up chestnuts while the Pope and his kids watched and gave out rewards for sexual aptitude. These weren't just the lies of witnesses who were against them. They were the true things that happened in Lucrezia's life. Instead of prayers and catechism, she learned how to survive amid predators. Lucrezia had already been engaged twice by the time she was 11. First to a Spanish lord when she was only 10, and then to another when politics changed. These weren't romantic plans, they were cold calculations. Each betrothal was a distinct connection that her father wanted to make or dissolve. Instead of learning how to embroider, the girl was learning that her body and name were things that could be traded for power. The change of Rodrigo Bouillet into Pope Alexander VI in 1492 was the start of Lucrezia's real troubles. She saw her father become the most powerful man in Christendom when she was 12 years old. He did this by bribing people so openly that even it startled people to see this in a time of corruption. Rodrigo had literally bought the Pope by providing large sums of money and promising jobs to get the votes he needed in the papal conclave. This rise did not bring about a divine change, but rather an increase in earthly desires. The new pope quickly began to use his status to make his family richer and satisfy his well-known desire for power and pleasure. The marriage of Lucrezia to Giovanni Forza at the age of 13 was planned with the same frigid accuracy of a military campaign. The event in the Vatican was more of a political merger than a wedding. Accounts from the time say that the 12-year-old bride was extraordinarily beautiful, with golden hair and an elegance that seemed otherworldly. This was a cover for the calculating mind that was already forming behind her naive appearance. But in the Borgia world, beauty was just another weapon, and Lucrezia was being taught how to use it to kill people. The family's perversions took place on the marriage bed itself. Reports from back then demonstrate that Pope Alexander VI wanted to know all the details about the consummation, which is not a good sign because he was too interested in his daughter's sexual initiation. Some witnesses went even farther, saying that the Pope insisted on being there for private moments between the young couple. However, these stories are still being challenged. There is no doubt that Lucrezia's father sacrificed her privacy, dignity, and innocence in order to have complete control over her. Later, Giovanni Forza, Lucrezia's first husband, would bring charges things would bother her for hundreds of years. The Pope tried to end the marriage when the political coalition he was part of became too much trouble. In response, Schwarzer said in public that the Borgia wanted him gone so they could keep having an incestuous connection with Lucrezia without anyone getting in the way. Whether they were true or not, these charges spread quickly in the gossip-filled world of the Renaissance, where the Borgia's real misdeeds made even the craziest claims seem possible. The ways that annulment works showed how deeply Lucrezia was humiliated. The Pope, who was her father, said that the marriage was not consummated even though they had lived together for 3 years. To back up this claim, midwives had to check Lucia's body to establish that she was a virgin even though she had been married for 3 years. Keeping up this lie, having her most private bodily state become a matter of public record and political necessity, was another step in her relentless dehumanization. But the worst blow came from her own family. Cesare Borgia, Lucrezia's brother, turned out to be much more evil than their father. Pope Alexander VI was driven by money and lust, but Cesare seemed to be driven by something deeper, a mix of political ambition and what many people at the time thought was an unhealthy fixation with his sister. Cesare was handsome, smart, and completely merciless. He became the enforcer of Borgia's plans, and Lucrezia found herself stuck between her father's intrigues and her brother's violent need to own her. Lucrezia's second marriage to Alonso of Aragon gave her a short look at what her life could have been like. She seemed to really love her new spouse at 17, and accounts from the time say that she was happy for a while. Rodrigo was born to her, and for a minute it looked like she might be able to get away from the corruption that surrounded her. The Borgias had made too many enemies, though, and they couldn't afford to be happy. The very love Lucrezia Alonso's feelings for her may have sealed his fate, since both her father and brother tended to perceive any emotional bond that wasn't theirs as a danger to their rule. Alonso of Aragon's murder is one of the most horrible parts of Lucrezia's tragedy. In 1500, Alonso was attacked on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica and badly hurt, but he didn't die because Lucrezia took care of him so well. She did everything she could to keep him safe, even cooking his food herself to keep him from getting sick. But she couldn't protect herself from her own brother. Cesare, who is said to have said that what wasn't done at lunch will be done at supper, went inside Alonso's sick room with his henchmen. Lucrezia and her sister-in-law were taken away by force, and Alonso was strangled in his bed. The stated cause of death was fever. Seeing her brother kill her husband while her father, the Pope, not only allowed it but probably told him to do it, destroyed any innocence that was left in her. Lucrezia. Witnesses said she had changed. The lively young woman was replaced by a ghost with sunken eyes who finally comprehended that she was not a person, but an object. For years, the tears she sobbed over Alfonso's body were the last time she let herself show real emotion in public. After Alonso was killed, rumors about Lucrezia's relationships with her father and brother got worse. Servants talked in hushed tones about being called to the papal apartments at midnight. Cesare's extreme jealousy toward any man who showed interest in his sister. The strange infant who came in the Borgia home. The infamous infants Romanus, whose parentage was hidden in purposeful doubt. Papal bulls disagreed with each other over where the child came from, with some saying Cesare was the father and others saying the Pope was the father. They all carefully avoided saying who the mother might be. Lucrezia's third marriage to Alonso d'Este of Ferrara was last change. At 21, she was no longer the naive porn star. She was a seasoned survivor who knew how to deal with the dangerous waters of Italian politics. The way she handled the negotiations for this marriage showed how well she had learned the Borgia lessons. She negotiated for status, dowry, and guarantees with the icy efficiency of a diplomat, knowing that if she was going to be sold like property, she would at least get the best deal possible. Ferrara gave Lucrezia something she had never had before, distance from her relatives that she had never known. While her father kept controlling things from Rome and Cesare built his own brutal kingdom in the Romana, Lucrezia started to become someone else. She supported the arts by spending time with poets and painters. She was a good administrator, and when her husband was away, she ran Ferrara with a skill that startled people who only knew her by reputation. It seemed like being away from her father and sibling for a short while made her feel free, ultimately become a person instead of an object. But it wasn't easy to get away from the past. When Pope Alexander V died in 1503, possibly from poison, though fever was the official cause, Lucrezia's reaction was very striking. Witnesses said she didn't cry or show any signs of emotion. Instead, she just acknowledged the news and immediately worried about her own political situation. The death of the guy who had given her life but taken her innocence only made her think about what to do next. This could have been the most honest sign, considering the devastation done, that a daughter may hear about her father's death and only feel better. Cesare's demise came quickly after. His enemies closed in on him without the Pope's help. The man who had scared Italy, maybe killed his own brother and definitely killed Lucia's husband, was caught, fled, and then slain in a small fight in Spain. Lucrezia's reaction to her brother's death was also quiet, but some people noticed that she wore mourning clothing for a long time. What the rules said. It's still a mystery in history whether this was real mourning for the brother, who had both protected and tormented her, or just another political move. Lucrezia showed how strong and smart she was during her years at Ferrara. She learned to speak many languages, wrote letters to the smartest people of her time, and built a court that was as culturally advanced as any in Italy. The poems written for her didn't talk about her bad reputation. They talked about her intelligence, her humor, and her support. Pietro Bembo, one of the great humanists of the day, wrote her passionate letters that showed she was a very smart and emotionally complicated woman. But even in Ferrara, Lucrezia couldn't get away from the effects of her childhood. She had a lot of hard pregnancies. She had a lot of miscarriages and stillbirths. Each loss reminded her of how her body had been used as a commodity since she was a youngster. The physical toll of being pregnant all the time, she was pregnant at least 11 times. Times, along with the mental scars from her childhood, made her a lady who was both strong and weak, powerful and weak. The kids who lived became both Lucrezia's salvation and her curse. She saw in them the chance to live a different life, one that wasn't affected by the Borgia heritage. People said she was a kind mother who sought to protect her children from the bad things that happened to her when she was a child. But she must have been on the lookout for traces of the Borgia all the time. Taint. She wondered if the faults of the fathers would show up in a new generation, and was afraid that the cycle of violence and manipulation would go on even though she tried her best to stop it. The letters she sent during this time show that she was a woman with a lot of depth and complexity. Lucrezia is hardly the toxic seductress of mythology. In her own letters, she comes out as smart, sophisticated, and desperately looking for meaning in a life that was formed by things she couldn't control. She wrote about art, philosophy, politics, and poems, although not often about her background. The lack of talk about her youth says a lot. Some wounds are too deep to talk about. The relationship with Alonso d'Este turned into something like a real partnership. This marriage was allowed to grow naturally without her family getting in the way right away, unlike her other marriages. At first, Alonso didn't want to marry the famed Lucrezia Borgia, but he grew to trust her judgment and respect her brains. She had offspring with him who would carry on the Este line, performing the dynastic purpose for which she had been nurtured, but on conditions that gave her some freedom and respect. Her last pregnancy in 1519 would kill her. Lucrezia had a hard pregnancy at 39 because she had been having children for decades and had a lot of stress from her exceptional life. Her daughter lived for a short time after she was born, and Lucrezia died of puerperal fever a few days later. People in Ferrara really mourned her passing. She had changed from the well-known Borgia daughter, became a recognized duchess and supporter of the arts. Witnesses said that the deathbed scene was very calm, which was unusual. People were shocked by how calmly the woman who had been through so much death accepted it. She made sure her kids were taken care of, settled her affairs quickly and efficiently, and got the final rites from priests who worked for an entirely different church than the one her father had ruined. Maybe she found the calm she had been looking for in death, in life. The real-life Lucrezia Borgia doesn't look much like the famous femme fatale from stories. There is no solid proof that she ever poisoned anyone, even if the infamous cannella poison is linked to her name. Enemies of Lucrezia and later romantics made up the story of her hollow ring that killed people. They thought it was more interesting than the truth, that she was a brutalized girl who grew up to be a good queen and patron of the arts. Historians of today have mostly restored Lucrezia's good name, seeing her as a victim of her family's ambitions rather than someone who helped them commit crimes. Even while it's hard to establish or reject the incest claims, they reveal more about the Borgia family's reputation and the enemy's propaganda than about anything that actually happened. It's evident that Lucrezia was emotionally, mentally, and maybe even physically assaulted on a regular basis from the time she was a toddler. Lucrezia Borgia's sad story not in the scandalous allegations that surrounded her, but in the fact that she was a smart, bright lady whose life was stolen from her by the desires of others from the time she was born. She was not allowed to choose her own path in life, was treated like property to be used for political gain, and was forced to watch as those who said they loved her killed the people she loved. That she came out of this crucible as a functional person, let alone a good ruler and supporter of the arts, shows how strong she is inside. This narrative is a strong criticism of the bad side of the Renaissance, the way authority completely contaminated the way women were treated like things, and even the highest religious leaders could act in the worst ways. Instead of being a place of spiritual teaching, the papal court became a quagmire of corruption that ruined innocence and twisted natural feelings. Lucrezia's story shows how institutional power that isn't held accountable or based on real religion always hurts the weak. Lucrezia Borgia's story is more than just a personal tragedy. It also shows us important truths about power, gender, and survival. She is a symbol of many women throughout history who were born into situations they couldn't change and had to deal with problems that seemed impossible. Her change from victim to survivor, from pawn to player, shows how people who are oppressed can sometimes find a way to act on their own, even if that way is limited and difficult. We look at Lucretia's life and must also face some painful truths about how history is recorded and remembered. For hundreds of years, the dirty whispers were more important than the facts. The story of a gorgeous poisoner sold better than the story of a child who had been through a lot of stress and grew up to be a good administrator. This distortion shows how sexism and sensationalism can change the way history is told, making victims out to be villains and hiding the genuine misdeeds of those in power. The real horror of Lucrezia Borgia's story is not in the overblown stories of poison and incest, but in the genuine life of a kid who lost her innocence, a young lady who lost her freedom, and a mother who died tired from a life that was never truly hers. She was born in 1480 as the illegitimate daughter of a man who would become the most corrupt pope in history. She never had an opportunity to live a normal life. There were things that were out of her control that affected every moment of her life. But she was able to make room for her dignity, intelligence, and even beauty in the limits of her life. One of the saddest things about Lucrezia's story is how normal it was in many respects. While the details of the papal corruption and family problems were quite bad, the general pattern of women being used as political pawn, not being able to make their own decisions, and being blamed for men's sins was very prevalent. The only thing that makes Lucrezia's story different is the way it is told, and the high levels of power that are involved. Many other ladies went through the same things but were never known, and their names are now lost to history. Their story not told. The last ironic thing about Lucrezia Borgia's life is that people mostly remember her for crimes she didn't commit. Even if the terrible things that happened to her are only footnotes, she has become a symbol of female evil in popular culture. Her name is linked to poison and seduction, but the men who really killed people and ruined the church are frequently shown as just ambitious or colorful evil. This switch of victim and villain is the last wrong that Lucrezia did even after she died and was remembered. Can't get away from the web of lies that have been spun around her. Today, as we deal with problems of power, abuse, and the exploitation of women and children, Lucrezia Borgia's narrative hits home in an unsettling way. The ways of control, isolation, gaslighting, breaking up support networks, and making abuse seem normal are still sadly familiar. The way powerful men may control organizations that are supposed to protect the weak. The way victims are blamed for what happened to them, and the way survival techniques are turned into proof of bad intent. These patterns still exist in current forms. What would Lucrezia Borgia have done if she had been born into a different family or time? Her knowledge, strength, ability to learn and adapt all point to the fact that she may have been amazing in ways that had nothing to do with controversy or survival. Instead, she became special in the only way she could, by putting up with things that were impossible and keeping some sense of humanity even as she was being systematically dehumanized. This may be the most important thing she left behind. The study of Lucrezia Borgia's life shows that the Renaissance was not a time of great human progress, but rather a time when the best and worst of art and intelligence coexisted with the worst of moral depravity. The Borgia Pope sprang from the same civilization that made Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. The same civilization that brought back classical learning also got better at killing people for political reasons. Lucrezia was in the middle of these two things that didn't make sense. Her story shows how people may be both products and victims of their time at the same time. As we finish looking at one of history's most misunderstood women, we are left with questions that are hard to answer. How do we judge people who are both victims and actors in corrupt systems? How do we tell the difference between the person and the propaganda? How do we remember the deceased while also learning from the things that make them suffer? There are no obvious principles or heroes in Lucrezia Borgia's life, or bad guys, just the complicated truth of people entangled in systems of power that ruin everything they touch. Even though she died 500 years ago, Lucrezia Borgia is still a mirror that shows us how humans deal with power, gender, and survival. She wasn't the deadly temptress of mythology. She was something much worse. A person who was denied their humanity from birth, forced to be part of her own tyranny, and who nevertheless managed to produce islands of beauty and meaning in a sea of depravity. Her narrative reminds us that the worst things people do to each other aren't in sensational fiction, but in real life when people kill each other while claiming to do it for love, family, or God. Lucrezia Borgia's tragedy wasn't that she was bad. It was that she was just an ordinary, smart, brilliant woman who was born into unusual circumstances that made her life take shapes that no life should take. She lived through what should have killed her and found ways to exercise agency while being under a lot of stress, and died with some serenity and respect. If there is redemption in her narrative, it isn't because she was cleared of crimes she didn't commit. It's because she showed how strong she was to be human amid horrible conditions. The bells that rang for Lucrezia Borgia's funeral in 1519 signified the end of a life that had started out so darkly. The illegitimate daughter of a corrupt cardinal who will become a terrible pope and the sister of a fratricidal psychopath, the pawn in a lot of political games. She had been all of these things, but she had also been a mother, a supporter of the arts, a good leader, and in the end, a survivor. It's sad that she became what she did, but it's even sadder that she could have been something else if she had been born into a world that saw women as people instead than attractive things to be sacrificed for power. The last cruel thing that history did to Lucrezia Borgia was to have her play parts that made it impossible for us to know who she truly was. The woman's inner existence is still a mystery, just like what really happened in the scandals that included her. What did she think about while she wasn't performing in front of people? What hopes vanished with every forced marriage, every loved one who was killed, and every pregnancy that ended in loss? There are no answers to these queries. The only sound was the echoing quiet of a voice that was never allowed to proclaim its own truth. The most disturbing thing about Lucrezia Borgia's life is how power structures can ruin even the most basic human connections. A father's love turned into ownership, a brother's safety become an obsession. Marriage turned become a business deal, and being a mother became a job. The logic of power twisted every natural feeling until nothing was left that wasn't dirty. To stay alive, Lucrezia had to get through this emotional wasteland, act like she loved people when she didn't, accept abuse as love, and confuse control with compassion. Lucrezia Borgia is not a symbol of bad women today. She is a symbol of strong women. Her novel takes away romantic ideas about the past and shows the Renaissance in all its brilliantly dark. She reminds us that development isn't always possible, that civilization and barbarism can live together, and that institutions that are supposed to safeguard us can also be used to hurt us. Most importantly, she reminds us that actual people are behind every historical scandal, and we shouldn't forget about their pain when we try to make their stories more interesting. The tragedy of Lucrezia Borgia makes us think about how we treat the weak, how we utilize power, and how we commemorate those who have died. Have to do whatever it took to stay alive. She was raised to be corrupt, groomed to be used, and made to go along with her own mistreatment. It's amazing that she still had any humanity left. It's not fair that history made her the bad guy instead of the victim. 500 years later, this hasn't been totally fixed. Lucrezia Borgia is still stuck in stories that other people have written even after she died. Her genuine self is as hard to find as the Renaissance's promise of freedom and dignity for all people.